I know it's only 2025, but I haven't seen a vampire movie in this decade that I didn't enjoy. From the campy and goofy ones like Renfield and Abigail to the more serious and dark movies like Sinners and Last Voyage of the Demeter, vampires are finally done with the pretty boys and the wannabe superheroes and are finally back to being scary. But easily my favorite vampire movie so far has been Robert Eggers' 2024 Nosferatu remake. It is easily my favorite version of the 1922 classic, which I learned is now in the public domain as of 2019. And that got me thinking about Count Orlok and his connections with Dracula. For a quick overview, if you don't know, the 1922 Nosferatu is the oldest remaining vampire movie, and an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. There's a lot of conflicting information on what happened in regards to everything from that time period, but to make a long story short, Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, sued the production company behind the movie, and they were ordered to destroy all copies of the film. Some copies had managed to survive, either through being hidden or making their way to America, where Dracula was already in the public domain due to faulty copywriting. Sources on this vary to an extent. Now that the movie is in public domain and Count Orlok is brought back to the public light with an amazing remake, how does he stand in a world dominated by Count Dracula? Is there enough differences between him and the Lord of Darkness for him to carve out his own place in pop culture? That's the question I want to look at today. I'm going to take a good hard look at both Count Orlok and Count Dracula, analyze what each of them brings to the table, and discuss how they could work separately or even together. Let's start with Count Dracula since he came first. Dracula has many powers in the original book, ranging from standard vampire affairs like super strength and flight, to more interesting and well-known abilities like controlling different animals, teleportation, and controlling storms. The novel also originates Dracula's status as the Vampire King, being able to control vampires and anyone who digested his blood. Many of these are still accepted as canon to Count Dracula, but the novel also establishes that he doesn't die in sunlight. Instead, he is only weakened and unable to use his full power. The death by sunlight is something I will bring up later, since it is something Orlok started. He has abilities that border on magic, like being able to reanimate people he killed, but Stoker never explicitly states if any of these are magic, since we know that Dracula has made deals with the devil in the past. Count Orlok, on the other hand, does have hints at magic throughout the entire movie. This isn't surprising given Murnau's interest in the occult. Orlok sends letters written in Enochian script back and forth to Thomas's boss, and is stated to be a descendant of Belial, the archdemon associated with the pestilence and plague. This association with the plague is actually the most interesting thing Orlok brings to the table, because it seems that wherever he goes, death follows en masse. While Dracula can control a wide variety of animals, Orlok controls rats explicitly, tying back to his plague imagery. Then there is his shadow, which is an iconic image that anyone who loves vampire movies should be able to recognize, but has also changed into a power in recent years. Eggers' remake uses the shadow for both incredibly powerful imagery of its own and a depiction of Orlok's power being expressed. Shadow manipulation and dark magic have changed drastically in the 100 years since the movie came out, but even in the original movie, his shadow was able to affect the world and even knock people unconscious. Now that the abilities are covered, let's start with analyzing the story elements of both vampires, starting once again with Lord Dracula. Very rarely does Dracula exist in a world where he's the only vampire, as opposed to Orlok, who is depicted as the only vampire in his original movie. This is something that has changed in both the 1979 remake by Werner Herzog and Eggers' 2024 remake. Dracula can exist in a world of darkness and monsters and not feel out of place, like in Castlevania, those old school Scooby-Doo movies, and, well, other stuff too. When it comes to characterization, oftentimes Dracula is depicted as a suave, sophisticated, gentlemanly type. He is poised and tactful, which is fitting for a man of his status. Dracula is a count, after all. Some of my favorite versions of Dracula lean heavily into this. The Castlevania's anime's first depiction of his encounter with Lisa is a great example of this, as well as the scene from Van Helsing where it's revealed that he is throwing a ball filled with vampires. When it comes to story, Orlok is rather interesting to discuss. Given that he was originally made to be a version of Dracula, you would expect a lot of what I said to transfer to him, but that isn't really the case. Yes, he's a count as well, but unlike Dracula, he isn't charismatic or handsome, he's ugly and monstrous. Eggers' remake depicts him as a barely functioning corpse that's decomposing, and even in the original, he has long bat-like ears, fangs that protrude from his front teeth, and long claw-like fingers. In many ways, Orlok feels like the vampire that Dracula would never allow himself to be. He is animalistic, primal, and pure evil that either can't hide or chooses not to. To make a rather interesting comparison, Dracula is like modern versions of Lucifer, whereas Orlok is like more classic versions. Whereas Dracula is a monster that could easily blend into a crowd on the street, Orlok would draw the eye immediately. So now is the time to say something that most people might disagree with, but I think Orlok is the one who started the connection between vampires and obsession. I admit it's been a little while since I've read Dracula, and my asexuality might be clouding my judgment a little bit, but I don't honestly believe Dracula was in love with or obsessed with either of the lead women in the novel. But Orlok was clearly in love with and obsessed with Ellen. This is much more apparent in Eggers' remake, but even in the original, it's clear he had some kind of strong obsession with her. Despite the two different women leads in the novel, Dracula only ever uses Lucy to feed, eventually turning her into a vampire. While a case could be made for Mina Harker, the novel seems to imply that Dracula has no romantic feelings for her in any capacity. Rather, he simply uses her as a tool for his convenience, a handy way to spy on the would-be vampire slayers. Nowadays, we see love and obsession as a core part of the vampire stories, but you can tell a story of Dracula without him being in love. You can't really do the same thing with Orlok. To take Ellen from Orlok is like taking Excalibur from King Arthur. It's a core and essential part of the story, and without it, the story just feels like it's missing something. The next story element I want to bring up is the sun. While both of these characters are creatures of the night, only Orlok ever explicitly dies in the sun. A scene so iconic that it changed vampire canon in a truly great way. Like I said earlier though, Dracula doesn't die in the sunlight. Rather, all it does is weaken his powers. There's an interesting element to that I don't see many people tackle, which may actually be Orlok's fault now. A more heroic Dracula could be seen a lot like Blade from Marvel, walking the border of both the human world in the world of darkness. A modern villain version of Dracula could depict him as a kingpin and the Prince of Darkness, leading gangs of men during the daytime and armies of darkness during the night. Orlok, on the other hand, would have to stay confined to the shadows. Oftentimes he's depicted as sleeping during the day or being inactive in some other way, but you could also simply keep him in the shadows. While there is a lot you could change about Orlok to make him work, I feel like his connection to darkness and the night should stay consistent. Not only does darkness help hide the form of Orlok and feed into the mystique, but it can feed into his shadow imagery and create more incredible scenes and shots. Once again, like Eggers did in his remake. For the next story point, I want to circle back to Dracula's title as Vampire King. While other vampires existed before Dracula, like Varney the Vampire and Carmilla, Dracula is obviously the most famous and most widely accepted version of the Vampire King. Earlier I said that Orlok is the only vampire in his original movie, and I honestly have mixed feelings about this. On one hand, Orlok being the only vampire in the world works to show his impure and otherworldly nature. One of the key principles of horror is to not explain every single thing to your audience, and having a being like Orlok exists with no explanation of his past or origin is a great way to build that suspense and mystery. Are there more like him, or is he an anomaly? What would someone have to do to turn themselves into something like that? And more importantly, is it worth it? On the other hand, having various monsters exist at once is a very popular idea for a reason. Underworld sold itself on the idea of vampires and werewolves going to war with each other. The original pitch of Castlevania was to have Conan the Barbarian wielding the whip of Indiana Jones and fighting the classic Universal monsters. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure features vampires, zombies, and the Pillarmen in the original universe. Van Helsing combined vampires, werewolves, Frankenstein's monster, and Jekyll and Hyde. The Dresden Files has its own vast catalog of creatures and monsters, and so many series with different monsters living alongside vampires. I think there's a lot of factors that decide why we are drawn to the idea of a world filled with monsters. From evolution teaching us to fear the dark, to writers wanting to surprise their audience with new elements of their story, many stories eventually add new monsters to the roster of their world. While I feel like this approach could work, would Orlok make a great vampire king? Personally, I don't think so. While Orlok's association with the plague seems ideal to paint a world brawling with vampires who have sworn loyalty to him, no variation of Orlok truly feels regal enough to be a king. Orlok's loneliness and obsession with Ellen make him feel less like a powerful and imposing figure and more like a desperate man who can't take no for an answer. Insert a Chad Dracula versus Virgin Orlok meme here. It's not quite what I was going for, but it'll work. While Orlok might be able to work as a king in some story, ultimately, I think too much of his story and being would need to be changed for it to work. One final point I wanted to bring up is something you're probably tired of hearing me say, but it's a quick discussion on Eggers' Nosferatu remake. When it comes to remakes, they can be a mixed bag at some points. Very rarely do you get a remake that stands tall enough to surpass the original and be seen as the definitive version of the movie. Not surprising, since most of them seem more content on being lazy cash grabs rather than being an actual love letter to the original. I would make a specific call out here, like the 2024 Crow remake, but I think I'll just gesture vaguely in the direction of modern Disney's live-action trend, and because it's that time of year as well, also throw the era of American remakes of foreign horror films under the bus too. Why do I bring this up? Because Eggers' Nosferatu joins what I believe to be the exclusive club of remakes that are actually better than the original, right up there with Peter Jackson's King Kong, Godzilla Minus One, and John Carpenter's The Thing. This movie is what I personally believe to be the new definitive version of this classic story, and when you can't make a better version of a story, it's time to start reimagining it. Okay, so maybe those examples aren't exactly the best to bring up for this point. With kaiju movies, it's hard to reimagine them, and The Thing is purposely vague enough to not ever be possible to really reimagine. But Orlok isn't a giant monster, some kind of space alien parasite thing. Orlok is a vampire, and vampire literature and media is incredibly malleable. Orlok himself is proof of that, with him being the vampire that is consistently cited as the first one to die by sunlight, a landmark moment that became accepted as vampire canon in most fictions, including modern versions of Dracula. Now that someone has finally told the story to the best that it can possibly be done, now it's time to start reimagining it. Rather than retelling the same story over and over again, it's time to take Orlok to new waters and really let him stretch his wings. A really good example of this I haven't talked about yet is the Shadow of the Vampire movie from 2000. For a quick summary, it is both a retelling of Nosferatu and meta reimagining that follows the film's creation. Willem Dafoe plays Max Schreck, the actual actor for Orlok, who is reimagined as an actual vampire that is obsessed with the lead actress. It reframes the end of the movie as an actual attack that left the main actress dead, and Schreck's death in the film being the result of the actress and production crew trying to save her. While I personally think there are more interesting ways to reimagine Orlok, I can't deny this version is very effective and really interesting. If you haven't seen it yet, I would recommend it, especially if you want to see Willem Dafoe act the hell out of being a vampire. Now that we've spent a good amount of time discussing how these two monsters can work alone, we should see how they can work together. I don't actually think this has been done too often, with the only thing coming to mind is the original Count Olrox from Castlevania Symphony of the Night, but there's actually a lot you could do here. Obviously, yes, the knee-jerk reaction of placing these two together in some sort of vampire civil war, but there's probably more we could do if we actually look at them as allies rather than enemies. Since Orlok would most likely have to take a backseat to the more suave and well-known Dracula, it opens up a lot of potential roles for him to fill. An assassin who strikes from the shadows, a vanguard who is sent in first to spread plague and decay, a spy who uses his rats to infiltrate castles and cities to gain intel, a magician on a war council whose access to dark magic makes him an irreplaceable asset to Dracula's army. The list is nearly endless. You wouldn't even have to make any changes to their appearances or abilities if you're creating a world with a wide variety of monsters. In a setting like that, would it really be a stretch to say there are different types of vampires? So does any of this answer the question of the video? What should we take away here? Ultimately, both of these vampires are just characters. You can shape them and mold them into whatever role in your story you need them to fit. Do you want to make Orlok the master of hell with an army of demons? You can do that. Do you want Dracula to be a love-struck man who desperately wants to make one woman his for all of eternity? You can do that too. Unfortunately, I don't think too many will deviate away from using Dracula for vampire media, simply because he already has a 100-year head start. But I hope this video at least gives someone pause to actually look at both vampires and choose the best one for their story. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to reinvent vampire media with another stunning version of the plague-bearing Count Orlok.